Welcome back to On-Site Report. My name's Theodore Abbott. So in this episode, we're wrapping up our discussion of False Creek South. I should note here that this episode will build on some themes discussed in episode 3 of On-Site Report. So if context is your thing, then go have a listen. If not, let's continue. I think it's important to highlight the significance of this area. Obviously, I'm doing 2 episodes on it. I have a point I'd like to drive home, and I think False Creek South is an area that helps me do just that. False Creek South is a neighborhood of unique livability. As we discussed last time, the community was planned with a third and a third and a third in mind. A third low income, a third middle income, and a third high income. False Creek South has a balanced urbanism, which is a quality that is not only celebrated in academic journals extensively, but this is also something that is palpable when walking through the maze of low-rise and mid-rise buildings, in between which are towering sequoias and gardens, sort of weaving trails this way and that. There's no straight lines. And none of it feels overly manicured either. I'm not sure if you've ever had the experience of going into someone's house and it feeling like a showroom. So pause this episode and go watch the first 3 seasons of Arrested Development to know what I'm talking about.
I'm showing this as a model again. I don't want people to think we've got shoddy workmanship.
Living in a sterile, literal show house. And then there are those homes that feel lived in. And they have the required bumps and bruises that display a quality of character. False Creek South has just that. It is a place where lives are being lived and families are growing. In other words, it feels like more than just a place where people go to rest their heads between shifts of selling their labor at the digital marketing firm where they help rich people sell crap that nobody really needs or wants. I digress. In this episode, I want to provide something of an answer to the TINA argument. There is no alternative. TINA, it's an acronym. Look it up. TINA is one of the catchphrases or one of the most popular slogans of Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister. It's the so-called Iron Lady. And this Thatcherism, if you will, contains within it the source code of the Iron Lady's approach to running the economy. Thatcher, along with Ronald Reagan, stand out as history's 2 biggest ambassadors of unregulated free market capitalism, which is an approach to running a capitalist economy that we now refer to today as neoliberalism. One of the most important dimensions of the neoliberal philosophy is something called trickle-down economics. In short, this is the belief that if we create wealth at the top of the social order, that wealth will trickle down to the underclasses. This has, of course, been widely debunked and written about extensively as a complete load of crap. But why am I bringing it up? I'm bringing it up because today, in the narratives and discourses that surround the housing crisis debate, if you will, we hear seamless echoes of basic free market neoliberal ideology. When you talk about how we approach building our cities today, people say there's no alternative. Almost verbatim, they'll use the same language that the most fervent defenders of neoliberalism did over 40 years ago. It's truly unparalleled. Well, I guess it truly is parallel, actually. So to lay things out, we have trickle-down economics, reinforced by the strongly asserted and largely accepted belief that there is no alternative to this approach. It's a great system. You establish a political economic philosophy, an ideology, a set of ideas, and then you just tell people that there's no other way of doing things. And if you do that enough, eventually people will start to accept it as gospel. And this is exactly what Margaret Thatcher did. And the same thing is happening right now with the way that we're approaching the urbanization of our cities, the development of our cities. So let me give you an example. This is the scenario. You're walking down the street with your friend. There's a new building getting put up in your neighborhood. Maybe it's a high-rise, maybe it's a sleek white condo, and you scoff and you say, gosh, I wish they wouldn't build that. But then your friend says, won't building more housing of any type help the situation? This is something we hear quite often. And it seems to make sense. A housing crisis, more housing, equals less housing crisis. So you'd think. But at its core, this is simply a form of trickle-down economics, and what it's called today in urban studies talk is filtering theory. Now, like Vancouver, San Francisco has been experiencing a housing crisis for several years. A while back, they set a new quota of 15,000 new homes per year. And some researchers at UC Berkeley decided to look into how exactly that would go about mitigating or ameliorating the housing crisis. And believe it or not, this approach does somewhat make things more affordable. And to the tune of 0.3% annually. So, to quote, research from UC Berkeley indicates that in a city like San Francisco, with geographic limitations and historic housing stock, similar to Vancouver, filtering could take at least 30 years to produce affordability for houses that are middle or low income. That is too long to wait for housing relief. Why will it take so long? ? Even if we reached the LAO report's theoretical rate of 15,000 new units built every year, the rent would only drop about 0.3% annually. So, more or less, I mean, this is the core of the NIMBY versus YIMBY battle that is being waged in Vancouver right now. There's all these people that say they're pro-housing, and whenever there's a new at-market tower going up, they say to anyone who's opposed to it, well, you're just a NIMBY. Well, obviously we would say to them, we're not NIMBYs, we just believe in building the right kind of housing for people. But they'll point your finger at you, they say, no, it works. If you add enough housing, eventually it will. And they are correct. It will bring down the cost of housing by 0.3% annually. The developers, they just make windfall profits because they're really only creating one type of housing, which they're cashing out big time on. And that's luxury units. So the rent would go down marginally. It says here, quote, the median San Francisco unit, currently $42,000 a year in rent, would still cost $41,880 next year. And they also say this is not affordable to the vast majority of San Franciscans, obviously. But Andy Yan had a great piece recently on this and a great analogy that he used, which we'll pipe in right now.
You can create a supply of Ferraris while the fact that people can only afford Hondas. Who is this ultimately going to be affordable to?
The fact of the matter is we're just building Ferraris, but people need Hondas. People can only afford Hondas, and we're only building Ferraris. So if you build enough Ferraris, it'll eventually make the Honda a little cheaper. That's the argument. And every time you build a new tower, right? Like the thing with the housing crisis in Vancouver is that, and this is parallel with other cities in along the west coast of North America, San Francisco and Los Angeles, to just name two, Portland as well, is that every time you build a new tower or luxury development in a gentrified area or an area that is gentrifying, you displace people and you push the most vulnerable residents, the people on the lowest rung of the housing ladder, you push them off. And in cities like Vancouver and Portland, when you push people off the housing ladder, they might end up couch surfing or they might end up living on the street. And in Vancouver, when you end up living on the street, that is something of a death sentence because the likelihood of you dying from a toxic drug overdose goes through the roof. Because as we know, poverty causes mental health issues, and mental health issues often lead to people using substances. That is the pattern. And then if you're in Vancouver, you're on the street and you're using substances, you're very, very likely to use one that it's been poisoned with some fentanyl or something. So the housing crisis in Vancouver, it affects people at all across the housing ladder. It displaces people. It even affects people who are homeowners. And then on the lowest rung, it literally is killing people. Filtering theory, neoliberalism, trickle-down economics, The point I'm trying to drive home is not to be fooled by the narratives that are being concocted right now in the housing crisis debate. We have to be vigilant, and we don't have to look back very far to see that these are just repackaged and rearticulated forms of neoliberal rhetoric. Furthermore, the fact that this assertion that there is no alternative, I'm often out at these events, and we'll look at digital renderings made by City Hall Watch, an amazing group of activists here in Vancouver. Go check them out, City Hall Watch. And they do these digital renderings of the Broadway plan, which is a new plan in Vancouver to build sort of a high-rise downtown jungle along the Broadway corridor, which will complement the new SkyTrain extension, or subway extension. In Vancouver, we have what's called the SkyTrain. And a very, very small percentage of these buildings will be, the floor space will be designated for affordable housing. The city always says we're aiming for 20%, but as Larry Beasley says, that 20% has always remained aspirational. In other words, we've never really managed to hit our target. So, I go out to these events and we're looking at these digital renderings, and people come up to me and they say, "What else can we do? How could we do it any other way? Isn't this sort of the only approach?" And it seems as though we have this incredible social amnesia, as though we have the memory of a goldfish when it comes to thinking about how we build our cities. And we don't have to go back very far or look very far for an example of a viable alternative. And that is why we're emphasizing so much on False Creek South. So I recently took a trip down into that neighborhood. On-site report, we went back to our on-site roots, and we got out into the community, boots on the ground, and I had a lovely conversation with a friend and a colleague named Ward Stirrat, who's a longtime resident of False Creek South, an activist, an entrepreneur, just an all-around incredible person. And he had some words to share around the current direction of urbanization in Vancouver and around the world. And he also took us on a little tour of the neighborhood. Hey, Ward, how's it going?
So I'm upstairs at True Cafe, which is got a patio upstairs with a tent over it, so it's all pretty chill.
Sweet. Okay, I'll just walk over there then. I'm just by the tennis courts. So Ward and I met up
How's it going?
at a cafe just on the outskirts of the False Creek South neighborhood.
So let's.
And after we sat down, right off the bat, I wanted him to speak on a question I've been asking myself, and I suppose asking a lot of other people too these days, which is, why do we actually live in cities? I'm actually just interested in that question pretty broadly. Why we live in cities too. Like, I was watching Push, this documentary called Push, and they talk about, one of the people that they interview talks about like why do we live in cities, and his answer is, he says it's like the chance encounters. He says it's the reason you live in cities is because the reason we do and other people do is because you have there's this like serendipity that exists in city life, which I thought was a good answer. But I've been just sort of mulling that around and chewing on it and thinking like, why do other people?
Yeah, I think at a substantive level, certainly that's not a substantive answer, but it certainly does speak to why we live in close proximity. We've always done that. You look at all civilizations, and we're all jammed. We like to jam together. It's just efficient for exchange. So, I don't know, I'm more of a system architect, system designer type of thinker. And, when you look at proximity, sort of proximal nature of components to interact, they have to have a closeness in order to interact. You can't fall in love with somebody if you don't meet them at the well. Right? Cities are an extension of our need to collaborate with one another, cooperate with one another, and to do it efficiently. When you look at cities themselves, you look for proximity, efficiencies. And so when you're designing a city, structuring it, you need to have a place for all these things. Look at the ants. They build highways, big highways that are major crossroads. They built air shafts for circulation. They built places where food and waste could be stored and grown. And they're replicant at a small scale throughout the whole structure. I think that cities are still stuck in that, servicing that model, even though when we walk around False Creek South and look at it as a low energy system that still services everybody, and that sort of walking and biking are the lowest energy transport forms.
Yeah.
Whereas if you live in the burbs, you're using the highest energy. I think that France had invested 3,000 euros per capita or something like that in biking infrastructure, which, by the way, lasts forever. And that saved them, or no, it was 3 billion in biking infrastructure, and that saved them 43 billion in healthcare costs. So the efficiencies are there. I like to run the numbers on things and look at it from more of a science based perspective, because the storylines are often perverted, right?
And that same thinking translates to poverty too, right? With the cost of having unhoused people living on the street is much higher than overall and over a certain amount of time than actually just housing those people. Is that kind of?
Yeah, it's a simple math, but the sort of the conservative, classical conservative slacker line goes something like, well, if you give them something, they won't work for it, and well, none of that's ever been evidenced anywhere ever.
Yeah.
So it's just a lie that's perpetuated, right?
I think that reminds me of Huey Segal, I think his name was, the only conservative member of parliament in Canadian history to ever advocate and endorse a universal basic income. And he wrote a book called Bootstraps Need Boots. And it was sort of a clap back to the classic conservative thinking that you, in order to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, he says, you got to have bootstraps first.
Boots are the first thing. People are not lazy. This is sort of the, the Ronald Reagan type of conservative lie that gets promulgated. And it's a fear-mongering, right? If we give it this, then society will collapse. Show me the evidence.
Yeah.
And of course they don't. What's that joke? If you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes conservative policy.
Yeah.
So, we see a lot of that in all the political dialogues. So it's usually a pack of lies. And so I like to suggest to everybody who's looking to gain some clarity about what it is that's really going on and what the solutions are, is just to not listen to what they say, watch what they do, and look at the facts of not what you're being told through the corporate-owned media and so on. Because it's heavily filtered. I mean, you just don't. You look at the housing minister and Robbie Calhoun and all the rest. classic neoliberalists that are just selling supply, which nowhere ever in the history of math and economics has ever produced what it purports to produce. So one of the things that we don't see now is this idea of a holistic view of things, right? So False Creek South was built on a holistic view. If you look at people who have made a study of housing economics, Cameron Murray, who's kind of wrote, Australian economist, he wrote his PhD thesis on corruption in real estate development. But he also, we had him out as a speaker for, belonged to a group of, universal basic income and also land taxers, right? And so he came out and he said, globally, and throughout the study he did for the last 300 years, on average, 33% own, 33% are in the process of owning, which means they have some debt associated, and 33% rent. And it's almost stable that way in terms of home ownership. On a global basis, 20 to 25% of the world lives in favelas around cities, right? So when you look at sort of the typical quintile distribution, these are the kind of things where you need to understand that there, in any distribution of society or any other thing, there's people at one end, big fat bulge in the middle, and then people at the other end. There always is. And so if you build a society that doesn't recognize that basic proven fact, then what are you really doing? You're building something else than for a stable society. And I think that's what False Creek was predicated on, is building for a stable society. Because it's 1/3 supported housing, 1/3 co-ops, and 1/3 market housing. So, it follows the 300 years of data collection that, Cameron Murray did in his historical analysis of housing ownership. But it also, each of those, or all of those elements are all intermingled with each other. This is the other thing that, we come back to the proximity equation. You can't have a chemical reaction or any action or interaction happen if there's not sufficient proximity between the two elements. Okay? This is why we store certain combustible things away from each other, because get them too proximal to each other and they'll interact, it'll explode. And this is the basis for building a stable and well-balanced society, is to make sure that the socioeconomic blending is there.
Whenever someone's having this conversation about affordability, co-op housing, or social housing, what have you, Singapore always comes up, because such a high percentage of the population live in government-owned or government-controlled units.
By choice.
And it's also interesting because it's the epicenter of the free market. It was the place that free market capitalism was imported first by Lee Kuan Yew, who is a bit of a despot in his own right. So it's this bizarre mixing of cultures. You have a complete embrace of social housing, yet you also have no holds free market capitalism in its own right, and so they're not incompatible. I mean, this is why I said at the top of the conversation, turn the volume down. Don't listen to what they're saying.
watch what they're doing. And if you watch what they're doing, it's good math, you know. You can have these things because all you're building is a balanced, sustainable system. That's it. That's all you're doing. And whether it's capitalism driving it or whether it's a mix, they're all mixed economies. I mean, the China economy is capitalism. It's like 88% capitalism and 10 or 12% socialism, right? The only thing that they have locked down is, the political agenda or the political choices, and that's 0% difference between the U.S. and the U.S.'s duopoly. Right? So there's a one-party system in China, and there's a one-party system in the U.S.
Okay, so it's starting to rain.
At this point, Ward took me on a tour of the neighborhood, and we continued our conversation while he was showing me some of his favorite spots around the area.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect time to go take a walk through the neighborhood.
So we're standing right in front of Twin Rainbows, which is on Lamius Mill Road, and so there's two co-ops that we're standing in front of. They're owned by the city, funded by CMHC in the 80s. Back when the government cared about building homes.
Yeah.
So in the co-op model, you basically you put your money in. You don't own a unit. You own a allocation within it, and the co-op management, which is a volunteer organization, will move you around depending on what your needs are. Right. So if you've got small kids, you get the bottom suites. Because that's what you need, right? And so the great thing about living here, I just live right between these two co-ops. So we're in the strata, we're in the premium residences, if you will. And but what you see and hear is kids playing in the backyard. So we're kind of going into the friends of ours that we walk the dog with every night, Gary and his friend, they built this pond for the co-op. So part of the whole thing is, and we're looking at a beautiful little Japanese pond with some goldfish in it, and a recirculating pump, and a beautiful little waterfall, and a beautiful little bench. And everybody has to contribute something to the common area cleanup, and as with any organization, there's usually 2% of the people that actually do that. But that this is the kind of stuff that is allowed in this model or encouraged in this model. This is the one place in Vancouver where you can still have a regular job as a teacher or a fireman or whatever, and live in Vancouver. Yeah. So this is kind of what we see in False Creek writ large. So in nature, there are no straight lines.
Yeah.
And so in this, my neighbor just walked by, we waved at each other. So everything is pedestrian oriented. Nothing is super crowded together. There's very flowy, curvaceous, very nicely landscaped, beautifully landscaped places here. And so as we walk through all of this is a repetitive theme, that we're living close to each other and we can interact with each other. So the chance encounter thing that we talked about earlier. Yeah. But this is the thing that I love, right? So this is why my wife and I both wanted to be in landscape architecture and urban architecture, because we really love the landscape and the sort of the way of designing so that you do have these many chance encounters, but there's a sufficient gap. There's a public space. What we're walking on now is inconceivable in the profit maximized market for building, which is large public areas that are beautiful and common, right? I don't know where the property line between our two adjacent properties is.
Yeah.
We don't think about that.
Yeah.
Except when there's a sewer line that breaks.
Yeah.
And then it's like, yeah, but you look at it and you go, wow, this is amazing. And this is what you should have as public space. And this is what we're constantly seeing being eroded, is public space and public amenities. So we see that with neoliberalism's infection of the thought process in government and elsewhere. But look at this. This is absolutely beautiful.
We're just on the bike path.
We're just on the bike path and walk path, and so my building looks out to, or is right on, the bike path and seawall, and then adjoins the park and the community center. So we're living right on it. So this is where the kids grew up. So I don't know whether they'll ever find somewhere else that's as compact and rich in terms of amenities. And this is what they're really trying to get rid of in the current corporate regime. We have the lowest private or public schools per capita. We have the lowest parks space per capita in Canada. And this is really all a function of getting rid of the common areas, so the public assets. And False Creek South is full of public assets. This is probably one of its fundamental structures. The connective tissue of it all is that all of these pathways and trees and landscapes, the meandering little pathways, that brings the social connections together and makes it very beautiful to live. Very quiet and peaceful. You go downtown and it's a sea of towers, and people aren't connected to the locality in the same way that they're. Not that there's anything bad about living in a tower, except that on a long term, it doesn't really build the community in the same way that ground-oriented access does, which is why in the co-op model and in the supported housing, the people who have family get the ground floor units rather than it being hoarded. Yeah. You can move, it's in the building, we'll all help you move your stuff. Yeah. It's not that complicated. This is one of the fundamental things, the fundamental problems, is using real estate, land essentially, as an investment structure. That's the fundamental problem. Because if you do that, then you set the circumstances for there to be winners and losers. And the table just keeps on turning heavier and heavier. The losers fall off because the winners of the housing as an asset class keep on outbidding everybody else. And that's the fundamentally unstable society that we're building. And I think that's the NIMBYism and all the rest of the stuff is just like blah blah. Yeah. Because there's no agency if you don't allow for the whole of society to be part of the dialogue. Yeah. If you just have one, the ultra rich who have structured the system, own the system, because they're the primary beneficiaries and the operators of the system. If you don't allow everybody at the other end of the spectrum, of that bell curve, to be part of the conversation, that's an autocracy. And that's what we have. We have a financial autocracy that we built. And kind of sucks as a society, right? And all of the garbage arguments that are foisted around NIMBYism and the housing crisis. Well, it's not a crisis. It is not a crisis. A crisis is a short-term, unexpected event. a feature of the system. It's entirely structured to be that way. So why are we allowing that to happen? Why would we build a society in that way? It makes no sense if you step back from the noise and just look at it from a systems level. So, you go back to the third. Well, that's the way that we've operated as a society for the last 300 years, probably longer, but that's, where the academic record that I know of kind of ceases. But, why would you build something that is short term and destined to failure? It makes no sense. And there's a lot of collateral damage along the way. I mean, you're a good example of it. Your generation, my daughter's generation, are hooped, right? Because there's been a systemic structural model enforced that allows everybody with more capital to outbid you, so that the thing that we should be keeping out of the system of wealth building is allowed in, and boom, then we have unstable society, which is just mental. When you say it out loud, it's like mental. Why would we build a society like that? But if the whole management system that we have, which is our governance system, is structured on that neoliberal model, then this is what we get. Because it just reinforces itself.
Ward, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Absolutely a charm, Theo. Thanks very much for having me.
That was my conversation with Ward Stirrat, and a big shout out to him for coming and spending an afternoon walking around the neighborhood with me. A lot of the time in radical discourses, people talk about the necessity of being able to imagine alternatives to the way that things are. At certain times and in reference to particular issues, this can be an undertaking that demands significant bandwidth. Luckily, with regard to the issue of housing and urban development in Vancouver, we have a neighborhood like False Creek South that can provide an example of how cities can be built in a way that does not seek to maximize profit, but rather optimize human livability. So thanks for listening to another episode of On-Site Report. Be sure to check us out on patreon.com/onsite report. We have a new series on there called Swaggerback, which is a short doc sort of series taking a look at the mayor of Vancouver named Ken Sim, which will be a lot of fun. Be good. If you can't be good, be safe.